Today we are going to study the poem Prothalamion written by the great Elizabethan poet Edmund Spenser. This poem is one of the most beautiful wedding poems in English literature. In this presentation, we will explore the background of the poem, the historical context, the meaning of the title, the occasion for which it was written, and a detailed explanation of its themes, imagery, symbolism, and poetic devices. By the end of this session, you will clearly understand how Spenser combines nature, mythology, and celebration to create a magnificent poetic tribute to marriage. Let us begin by understanding the life of the poet who wrote Prothalamion, Edmund Spenser. Spenser was born in the year 1552 in London, England. He came from a middle-class family that did not have great wealth, but valued education and learning. Because of this, Spenser received a good education from an early age. He studied at Merchant Taylors' School, one of the important schools in London at that time, where he developed a strong foundation in literature and classical learning. Later, Spenser entered University of Cambridge, specifically Pembroke College. His years at Cambridge were very important in shaping his intellectual and poetic development. During his studies there, he was deeply exposed to classical literature, particularly the works written in Greek and Latin. He studied Greek and Latin poetry carefully and learned the techniques and artistic traditions of classical poets. At the same time, he was influenced by the spirit of Renaissance humanism, which emphasized the revival of classical knowledge, beauty, and intellectual excellence. All these influences played a major role in forming Spenser's rich poetic style, his use of mythology, and his musical language. Edmund Spenser spent the later years of his life working and writing, and he became one of the most respected poets of the Elizabethan age. He died in 1599 in London. As a mark of honor, he was buried in Westminster Abbey, in the famous Poets' Corner, close to the grave of Geoffrey Chaucer, which shows the great respect that English literary tradition has given to him. Now let us look at the career and literary identity of Edmund Spenser. After completing his education, Spenser did not immediately become a full-time poet. Instead, he served in government administration in Ireland. During the Elizabethan period, many writers depended on influential patrons for financial support and recognition, and Spenser was no exception. Two of the important patrons who supported him were Robert Dudley and Sir Walter Raleigh. Among them, Sir Walter Raleigh played a particularly important role in Spenser's career. Raleigh admired Spenser's poetry and introduced him to the royal court of Queen Elizabeth I. This connection with the royal court helped Spenser gain recognition and prestige. Because of this royal association and his poems that celebrated the ideals of the Elizabethan age, Spenser gradually came to be known as a court poet. When we speak about Spenser's literary identity, critics often describe him with the title, the poet's poet. This means that many later poets admired his artistic skill and poetic beauty. In fact, Spenser is often regarded as the greatest English poet between Geoffrey Chaucer and William Shakespeare. His reputation comes from several important qualities in his poetry: his musical and melodious language, his rich and vivid imagery, and his creative use of innovative stanza forms. These features made his poetry elegant, imaginative, and highly influential in English literary history. Let us now look at some of the major works written by Edmund Spenser, which established him as one of the greatest poets of the Elizabethan period. His first major literary work was The Shepherd's Calendar, published in 1579. This work brought him early recognition as a poet. It belongs to the pastoral tradition, which means it presents rural life, shepherds, and nature in an artistic and symbolic way. The poem is carefully structured into 12 eclogues, each representing a different month of the year, and it reflects both poetic creativity and moral reflection. Spenser's greatest and most famous work is The Faerie Queene, published in two major parts in 1590 and 1596. This is a long epic allegorical poem and is considered his masterpiece. In this poem, Spenser presents different moral virtues through symbolic knights and adventures. At the same time, the poem celebrates the ideals of the Elizabethan age and praises Queen Elizabeth I, who is represented symbolically within the work. Another important poem by Spenser is Epithalamion, written in 1595. This poem is a marriage hymn composed to celebrate Spenser's own wedding. It beautifully describes the events of the wedding day and expresses joy, love, and the sacredness of marriage. Finally, in 1596, Spenser wrote Prothalamion. This poem is also related to marriage, but unlike Epithalamion, it celebrates the upcoming wedding of two aristocratic sisters. The poem combines nature imagery, classical mythology, and celebration to create a graceful poetic tribute to marriage. Now let us understand the meaning of the title Prothalamion. The title comes from the Greek language and it has two important parts. The first part is pro, which means before. The second part is thalamos, which means the marriage chamber or the bridal room. When these two words are combined, the title literally means a song sung before the wedding. Therefore, Prothalamion refers to a poem that celebrates a marriage before the actual wedding ceremony takes place. It is essentially a pre-wedding song written to honor and celebrate the upcoming marriage. In literary tradition, poems that celebrate weddings are called epithalamic poems. While an epithalamion usually celebrates the wedding day itself, a prothalamion is written before the marriage ceremony. So, through this title, Edmund Spenser clearly indicates that the poem is a joyful poetic celebration anticipating a wedding and blessing the couple even before the ceremony begins. Now let us understand the occasion on which Prothalamion was written. This poem was composed to celebrate a special double marriage that took place among the English aristocracy. The poem honors the upcoming weddings of two noble sisters, Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset. These sisters belonged to an important noble family and were the daughters of Edward Somerset, who held the title of the Earl of Worcester. In the Elizabethan period, marriages among noble families were often grand social events. Such weddings were not only personal celebrations but also important social occasions that strengthened family alliances and prestige. Because of this significance, poets were sometimes invited to compose poems to honor these marriages. It was in this context that Edmund Spenser wrote Prothalamion in the year 1596. Through this poem, Spenser celebrates the beauty, grace, and noble status of the two brides while also creating a festive atmosphere filled with imagery of nature, mythology, and joyful celebration. The poem therefore functions as a literary tribute to the double wedding of these aristocratic sisters. To understand the poem Prothalamion more clearly, it is important to look at the historical background in which it was written. The poem was composed during the late Elizabethan period, a time when England was ruled by Queen Elizabeth I. This period is often considered one of the most vibrant and influential eras in English cultural history. During this time, England experienced a considerable degree of political stability and national confidence. The country was becoming stronger both politically and economically, and this stability created a favorable environment for the growth of art and literature. As a result, the Elizabethan period witnessed remarkable cultural flourishing. Another important influence during this time was the Renaissance. Renaissance ideas encouraged the revival of classical learning, appreciation of beauty, and interest in Greek and Roman mythology. These ideas strongly influenced the poetry of Edmund Spenser, especially in poems like Prothalamion, where classical mythology and nature imagery play an important role. This golden age of literature also produced many great writers, including Christopher Marlowe, William Shakespeare, and Ben Jonson. Together, these writers shaped the richness and brilliance of English literature during the Elizabethan era. The poem Prothalamion belongs to the epithalamic tradition in literature. Epithalamic poetry refers to poems or songs that celebrate marriage and the union of a bride and groom. These poems are usually written to bless the couple and to create a joyful atmosphere around the wedding celebration. In classical and Renaissance literary traditions, such poems often include descriptions of beauty, nature, love, and harmony. Edmund Spenser himself wrote another famous wedding poem titled Epithalamion, which celebrates his own marriage. Later poets also followed this tradition. For example, John Donne wrote several poems associated with wedding celebrations. Thus, Prothalamion is part of a long poetic tradition that honors and celebrates marriage through lyrical poetry. Now let us look at the structure of Prothalamion. The poem is carefully organized into 10 stanzas. Each stanza develops the imagery of nature, celebration, and the approaching wedding procession. One of the most striking structural features of the poem is its refrain. At the end of every stanza, the same line is repeated: "Sweet Thames, run softly, till I end my song." This repeated line gives the poem a musical quality and also reflects the calm and gentle flow of the River Thames. The refrain creates unity throughout the poem and reminds the reader that the poet is narrating this celebration along the peaceful banks of the river. Let us begin with the first stanza of Prothalamion, written by Edmund Spenser. This stanza sets the emotional and thematic foundation for the entire poem. At the beginning of the stanza, the poet presents himself walking along the peaceful banks of the River Thames. However, his mind is not calm. He feels disappointed and troubled. The reason for this sadness is connected to his personal life. Spenser had hoped to receive strong royal patronage and recognition from the court of Queen Elizabeth I, but his expectations were not fully fulfilled. Because of this frustration and disappointment, he decides to leave the busy city environment and walk beside the river. The movement from the crowded city to the quiet riverbank is very significant. It symbolically represents the poet's search for peace and emotional balance. In Renaissance poetry, nature is often presented as a source of comfort and healing. As the poet walks along the river, the calm flowing water, the gentle breeze, and the quiet natural surroundings begin to soothe his troubled mind. The peaceful scenery gradually replaces his sadness with a sense of calm reflection. In this stanza, nature becomes almost like a companion to the poet. The river is not just a physical setting, it becomes an important symbolic presence. The poet speaks directly to the river in a beautiful line: "Sweet Thames, run softly till I end my song." Here, the River Thames is gently personified, as if it can listen to the poet's voice. By asking the river to flow softly, the poet creates a calm musical atmosphere for his poetic narration. This line is repeated at the end of every stanza, forming the refrain of the poem. The refrain serves several purposes. First, it creates a lyrical rhythm that makes the poem sound musical and harmonious. Second, it connects all the stanzas together, giving the poem structural unity. Third, the gentle flow of the river symbolically mirrors the smooth and graceful movement of the poem itself. Another important point to notice is the mythological and classical atmosphere that Spenser begins to prepare in this opening stanza. In Renaissance poetry influenced by classical traditions, rivers were often associated with river gods and nature spirits. By addressing the Thames in such a respectful and poetic way, Spenser indirectly places the river within this classical mythological tradition, preparing the reader for the later appearance of mythological figures such as Venus, Cupid, and Hymen in the later stanzas. Therefore, the key idea of the first stanza is the healing power of nature. The poet begins with personal disappointment, but the peaceful beauty of nature begins to restore his emotional balance. This stanza not only introduces the setting of the poem but also establishes the gentle tone, musical rhythm, and symbolic atmosphere that will continue throughout Prothalamion. In the second stanza of Prothalamion, the mood of the poem begins to change from quiet reflection to a scene of beauty and celebration. While walking along the banks of the River Thames, the poet suddenly notices two beautiful swans gliding gracefully on the surface of the water. Their movement is smooth and calm, perfectly matching the gentle flow of the river. These swans are not described merely as birds. In the symbolic language of the poem, they represent the two brides whose marriage the poem celebrates: Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset. By presenting the brides in the form of swans, Edmund Spenser uses symbolism to elevate their beauty and dignity. The description of the swans emphasizes their white color, their elegance, and the calm movement. In literary tradition, the swan is a very powerful symbol. It is often associated with purity, beauty, grace, and nobility. The whiteness of the swan suggests innocence and moral purity, which were highly valued qualities for brides in the Renaissance period. The graceful movement on the water represents elegance and refinement, qualities expected from aristocratic women. The atmosphere of the stanza also begins to take on a mythological tone. The calm river, the gentle flow of water, and the appearance of the two majestic swans create a scene that almost feels divine and magical. In classical mythology and Renaissance poetry, swans were often connected with beauty, music, and divine inspiration. They were also associated with gods and sacred rivers. Because of this tradition, the appearance of the swans suggests that the upcoming marriages are not ordinary events but celebrations worthy of divine attention. This transformation of natural scenery into symbolic meaning is one of Spenser's major poetic techniques. The swans become a poetic representation of the two noble brides, and the peaceful river setting turns into a ceremonial space preparing for a wedding procession. For competitive examinations, it is important to remember that in Renaissance poetry the swan frequently symbolizes nobility, grace, and purity. In Prothalamion, the two swans therefore function as elegant symbolic representations of the two aristocratic brides whose marriage the poem celebrates. In the third stanza of Prothalamion, the poem begins to move from a simple natural scene into a richly imaginative and mythological world. After noticing the two swans that symbolize the brides, the poet now describes the arrival of a group of river nymphs along the banks of the river Thames. In classical mythology, nymphs are gentle female spirits connected with nature. They are believed to live in rivers, forests, mountains, and springs. These mythological beings represent the beauty and vitality of nature. In Renaissance poetry, poets frequently included such figures to give their poems a classical and magical atmosphere. By introducing these nymphs, Edmund Spenser connects his poem with the rich traditions of Greek and Roman mythology. The nymphs in this stanza appear as attendants preparing for a wedding celebration. They begin gathering flowers from the riverbanks and surrounding fields. These flowers are intended to decorate the brides and the wedding procession. The act of collecting flowers symbolizes preparation, joy, and celebration. Flowers themselves are traditional symbols of beauty, freshness, love, and fertility, which makes them especially suitable for a wedding context. At this point, the poem becomes more elevated and ceremonial. The presence of mythological figures transforms the natural setting into something almost sacred. Spenser also begins to introduce references to important figures from classical mythology such as Venus, the goddess of love and beauty, and Cupid, the god of love who inspires romantic affection. These mythological references strengthen the central theme of love and marriage within the poem. Through these classical allusions, Spenser suggests that the upcoming wedding is not merely a social event but something worthy of divine attention. Nature spirits, mythological figures, and beautiful natural imagery all come together to celebrate the occasion. The wedding is therefore elevated from an ordinary human ceremony to a grand and almost divine celebration, blessed by the powers of nature and mythology. In the fourth stanza of Prothalamion, the focus of the poem moves directly to the brides themselves. After preparing the setting with nature, swans, and mythological attendants, Edmund Spenser now begins to praise the beauty and dignity of the two brides. The brides, Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset, are described in highly elevated language. Spenser portrays them as graceful, noble, and radiant figures. Their appearance is not presented as ordinary human beauty but as something almost divine. Their elegance, purity, and dignity make them appear worthy of admiration and celebration. To emphasize this extraordinary beauty, the poet compares the brides to classical goddesses. Such comparisons were very common in Renaissance poetry. By associating the brides with divine figures, Spenser suggests that their beauty is perfect, harmonious, and worthy of reverence. For example, the grace and charm remind the reader of Venus, the goddess of love and beauty. This type of mythological comparison elevates the brides from ordinary women to figures of almost divine perfection. This description also reflects an important Renaissance ideal of beauty. During the Renaissance, beauty was not seen as merely physical appearance. Instead, beauty was believed to reflect deeper qualities such as virtue, nobility, and harmony. A beautiful person was expected to possess moral goodness and refined character. Therefore, when Spenser praises the beauty of the brides, he is also indirectly praising their noble character and moral purity. For competitive examinations, it is important to remember that Elizabethan poets frequently used classical mythology when describing women. Comparing women to goddesses from Greek and Roman mythology was a common poetic technique. In Prothalamion, these comparisons help create an atmosphere of grandeur and celebration, presenting the brides as noble figures worthy of admiration and honor. In the fifth stanza of Prothalamion, the poem develops into a more active and festive scene. The two swans, which symbolize the brides Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset, continue to glide gracefully along the waters of the River Thames. Their smooth and steady movement gives the impression of a formal procession, similar to a royal wedding parade. As the swans move forward, they are no longer alone. They are accompanied by attendants who add to the ceremonial atmosphere. The presence of music, flowers, and joyful companions creates a sense of celebration. Music symbolizes harmony and happiness, while flowers represent beauty, fertility, and the beginning of a new life. These elements together create the mood of a grand wedding festival. At this stage, the peaceful natural environment begins to transform into something more symbolic and ceremonial. The river is no longer just a natural landscape. Instead, it becomes a symbolic pathway for the wedding procession. The gentle movement of the swans along the flowing water resembles the movement of brides approaching their wedding ceremony. This symbolic transformation is very important. In Renaissance poetry, natural elements were often used to represent human experiences. Here, Edmund Spenser uses the river as a ceremonial road that carries the brides toward their future married life. The smooth and calm flow of the river suggests harmony, stability, and prosperity for the marriages. Thus, in this stanza the poem moves from simple description to symbolic celebration. The swans, the attendants, the music, and the flowers together create a festive wedding atmosphere, while the river itself becomes a majestic natural pathway guiding the brides toward their joyful union. In the sixth stanza of Prothalamion, the tone of the poem becomes more reflective and blessing-oriented. After describing the graceful procession of the swans and the festive atmosphere around them, Edmund Spenser now turns his attention to expressing sincere wishes for the happiness and prosperity of the two brides, Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset. In this stanza, the poet presents marriage as something sacred and meaningful. The union between the bride and groom is not simply a personal relationship but an important social and moral institution. In Renaissance thought, marriage was considered a divine and honorable bond that brought together not only two individuals but also two families. Because of this belief, weddings were often celebrated with great joy and ceremony. The language used in the stanza reflects feelings of happiness, hope, and harmony. The poet wishes that the brides will experience a joyful married life filled with love, peace, and mutual respect. This idea reflects the Renaissance concept that marriage should be based on harmony between partners. Harmony was considered one of the highest ideals during this period because it represented balance, order, and stability in both personal and social life. Another important aspect of this stanza is its moral significance. Through his blessings, Spenser suggests that marriage plays an essential role in maintaining social stability. When marriages are successful and harmonious, families become stable, and society itself becomes more organized and peaceful. Therefore, marriage is presented not only as a romantic union but also as a foundation for social harmony. The calm setting of the River Thames continues to support this idea. The gentle flow of the river symbolizes a smooth and peaceful journey into married life. Thus, this stanza emphasizes the sacred, joyful, and harmonious nature of marriage while also highlighting its importance for the stability and well-being of society. In the seventh stanza of Prothalamion, the poem reaches a more ceremonial and mythological stage. After describing the wedding procession and offering blessings to the brides, Edmund Spenser now calls upon a divine figure associated with marriage. The poet invokes Hymen, who in classical mythology is known as the god of marriage and wedding ceremonies. In Greek and Roman traditions, Hymen was believed to preside over weddings and bless the union of couples. During ancient wedding celebrations, songs were often sung in honor of Hymen to invite his presence and to ensure a successful and joyful marriage. Because of this tradition, the invocation of Hymen became a common feature in wedding poetry. By calling upon Hymen in this stanza, Spenser elevates the marriage ceremony from a purely human event to something that receives divine approval. The presence of the god symbolically ensures that the marriages of Elizabeth Somerset and Catherine Somerset will be blessed with happiness, fertility, and harmony. This mythological reference also reflects the strong influence of Renaissance humanism. Writers of the Renaissance often revived classical mythology from Greek and Roman literature and used it in their poetry to enrich meaning and create a sense of grandeur. By introducing Hymen into the poem, Spenser connects the wedding celebration with ancient cultural traditions and gives the ceremony a sacred and festive tone. For competitive examinations, it is important to remember that the invocation of Hymen is a typical feature of epithalamic poetry. Poets frequently included this figure in wedding poems to symbolize divine blessing and to emphasize the sacred nature of marriage. In Prothalamion, this invocation strengthens the ceremonial atmosphere and highlights the cultural importance of the wedding celebration.